Imagine yourself, transported to the golden sands of the Libyan desert, where a daring young military officer emerges from the shadows to redefine the course of history. A man who was both eccentric and full of revolutionary ideas, he became an enigmatic figure of the 20th century. It is, unquestionably, one of the most influential and controversial figures in our history, Muammar Gaddafi. From his rise to power in a peaceful coup in 1969 to his shocking death in 2011, Gaddafi led Libya in a reign that earned him the allegiance of many African leaders while commanding adoration, but also contempt, on a global scale. A visionary hero to some, a dictator and promoter of terror to others, he was praised by Nelson Mandela for his support of liberation movements in South Africa, while being called the rabid dog of the Middle East by US President Ronald Reagan because of his provocative foreign policies towards the West. Hold on tight, because today we are going to dive into a breathtaking story, shedding light on the controversial reign of Muammar Gaddafi. The man we know today as Muammar Gaddafi was born in June 1942 into a Bedouin family, in a humble tent in Casa Buhadi, south of the city of Sirte, in the western desert of Libya. His father, Muhammad Abdul Salam, nicknamed Abu Minya, lives the life of a shepherd, raising goats and camels for a meager livelihood. His mother, named Aisha, shares with him his Arab origins in the impoverished rural communities that made up most of Italian Libya. However, to truly understand Gaddafi's personality, we need to go back to September 28, 1911. On that day, Italian warships invaded the coast of Tripoli, marking the beginning of an Italian occupation and an era of terror in Libya. Libyans, exploited and oppressed, endured the horror of squalid labor camps and cruel public executions for decades. This dark chapter did not end until 1943 when the Allies finally drove the Italians out of North Africa, but not before costing the lives of more than a third of the Libyan population. At the end of World War II, Libya was divided between the British and French spheres of control. For a decade, negotiators from various nations debated the future of this former Italian colony. Initially in favor of a return to divided colonial status, Italian and British officials faced opposition from other parties. The United Kingdom supported the emergence of a monarchy, the Senussi dynasty, which had ruled since independence in 1951. King Idris I is chosen as the first monarch, establishing Islam as the state religion. Remaining loyal to Western countries, the king promoted British economic and military interests. However, Gaddafi's life was not easy, as his family belonged to the KADHAFI tribe, Arabic-speaking Berbers exiled from the eastern part of Libya, Cyrenaica. When he was 9 or 10 years old, Muammar Gaddafi's father decided to send him to school for the first time in a town of about 7,000 inhabitants. Although education in Libya is not free, his father, despite the financial difficulties, sees it as a beneficial opportunity for his son. Gaddafi, showing promising talents, was sent to elementary school, perhaps in the hope that he would accomplish great things. While the young Gaddafi was in school, Libya was plunged into poverty, and he was despised because of his Bedouin roots. On weekends and holidays, he returns to his home on the outskirts of the city after spending his nights in the local mosque. Meanwhile, King Idris I sells land to the US military, fueling his family's wealth. It is a blatant act of corruption, humiliating to ordinary Libyans, but indicative of the broader disease plaguing the Arab world. In 1959, the discovery of oil quickly transformed Libya from one of the poorest to one of the richest countries in the world. However, foreign oil companies control extraction, fixing prices to their advantage and pocketing half of the revenues. The government of Idris I is also receiving millions to host a US air base in Libya. It was in this context that Muammar Gaddafi grew up. During this period, a shining star emerged in the Arab world, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian leader who staged a coup to overthrow Egyptian King Farouk in 1952, when Gaddafi was about 10 years old. Nasser ignited the spark of Arab nationalism, and Gaddafi eagerly absorbed pan-Arabist revolutionary ideas emanating from Egypt. He listened assiduously to the Cairo radio program, The Voice of the Arabs, memorizing Nasser's speeches advocating Arab unity and condemning Western imperialism. His copy of Nasser's Philosophy of the Revolution became his most prized possession. Nasser's audacity, his ambition to expel Western influence in Egypt, socialize the nation, and unite the Arabs of the Middle East and North Africa, lit a fire in Gaddafi's soul, as it did for so many others. At only 17 years old, Muammar Gaddafi began to dream of leading a revolution in Libya. Already considered a leader among his peers because of his powerful personality, he distinguished himself at school by organizing demonstrations against the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the French atomic test, and in support of the anti-colonial revolution in Algeria. Expelled for his political activity, this expulsion only strengthened his ambition to become the Libyan Nasser, leading to the creation of a group of like-minded students. 5 years later, in 1964, Gaddafi entered the military academy while taking part-time courses in history and geography at Benghazi University. He founded the United Free Officers movement, modeled after Abdel Nasser's Egyptian movement. In 1966, he went to the United Kingdom for training in signaling before graduating. During this period, anger towards the conservative rule of King Idris I grew among Gaddafi's army and the emerging middle class. Accused of nepotism and corruption, the king, who has been in power since independence, is seen as deeply corrupt and too aligned with Western interests. Convinced that fate was on his side, Gaddafi was simply waiting for a sign that Libya was ready for revolt. This sign arrived in 1967 with the Six-Day War. The Arab countries' crushing defeat at the hands of Israel provoked a revolt in Libya, marking the first major sign of dissent against Idris' rule. For Gaddafi's free officers, this is the long-awaited signal to act. Faced with the impasse in organizing a popular revolution against the monarchy, the officers opted for the path of a coup d'état. A carefully prepared method, involving the infiltration of the army and the recruitment of new members. Gaddafi imposed strict discipline and draconian lifestyle rules on his accomplices. The first attempt, scheduled for March 12, 1969, was abandoned, as the presence of senior officers at a recital by the famous musician Kulthum made their arrest impossible. Finally, on September 1, 1969, everything was ready. Gaddafi and his fellow officers launched the coup against King Idris I, who was then in Turkey for medical treatment. Crown Prince Hossein As-Sanusi, who is set to become king on September 2 with the expected abdication of King Idris on August 4, finds himself under house arrest before the end of the day on September 1. Without shedding a drop of blood, Gaddafi and his troops took control of the army and the country, ending the monarchy and proclaiming the Libyan Arab Republic. At only 27 years old, the young Bedouin, born in a tent, suddenly finds himself at the head of Libya. Gaddafi became the undisputed leader of the new government, dubbed the Libyan Arab Republic. From the beginning, he implemented his bold vision of a Libya independent of foreign influence, rooted in Arab nationalism. The immediate implementation of his vision for a Libya free from foreign influence and based on Arab nationalism begins. Surprisingly well received at the time, the coup was widely accepted by the Libyan population, who were disappointed by the weak and ineffective rule of King Idris I. Internationally, the reaction is also positive, with Henry Kissinger, the U.S. Secretary of State, ready to consider Gaddafi's request to close U.S. bases in Libya. Curiously, the only group unhappy with the idea of a Gaddafi-led coup is the free officers themselves. They attempted another coup in December to replace him, but were quickly crushed. King Idris sought in vain for help from the United Kingdom, but British officials were very reluctant to intervene in the Middle East. The monarchy quickly collapsed, leaving Gaddafi and his supporters with full control of the state. At the dawn of the new decade, Libya was entirely under Gaddafi's control. In the 1970s, a new chapter opened for Libya. Inspired by Nasser, Colonel Gaddafi launched a series of bold reforms: nationalization of key assets, free education, and distribution of money to the poorest. Yet the outside world, including the Arab world, pays little attention to Libya, while Gaddafi prioritizes addressing the unjust economic legacy of foreign domination. He put an end to arms contracts with British companies, expelled the remaining 25,000 Italians and Jews, and nationalized foreign banks. The Italian government, dependent on Libyan oil, remains silent in the face of these bold actions. Gaddafi is also attacking the oil sector, saying that the trade terms prevailing for Libyan oil are unfair. He demanded a renegotiation, threatening to cut off production if the oil companies refused. Defying foreign oil leaders, he says Libyans can live without oil for a few years to get their rightful rights. This gamble succeeded, making Libya the first developing country to secure a majority of its oil production revenues. The Arab oil boom of the 1970s took off, but Gaddafi's revolution resulted in an estimated loss of $100 million in British investment in oil infrastructure and access to military bases. Although frustrated, British officials privately acknowledged that Gaddafi's revolution is popular and that his charismatic leadership cannot be ignored. However, everything changed on September 28, 1970, when Gamal Abdel Nasser was struck down by a massive heart attack. The undisputed master was gone, leaving the Arab world in a difficult period. Gaddafi, loudly claiming that he was Nasser's heir, declared that he would guide them all from now on. He even tried to pick up the torch from the ideological leader of Arab nationalism by proclaiming the Federation of Arab Republics in 1972, uniting Libya, Egypt and Syria in the hope of creating a pan-Arab state. However, the three countries could not agree on the specific terms of the merger. As the Middle East mourns the loss of its hero, Gaddafi falls out with Nasser's successor, Anwar Sadat, who begins to curb his pan-Arab dreams. This feud culminated in a brief border war in 1977, leaving Gaddafi and Libya humiliated. In 1974, Gaddafi signed a union agreement with Tunisian President Habib Bourguiba, but this also failed in practice, turning differences between the two nations into deep animosity. Gaddafi's Libya also found itself embroiled in a territorial dispute with neighboring Chad over the Aouzou Strip, occupied by Libya in 1973. This dispute led to a Libyan invasion of Chad, and a conflict that ended with a ceasefire in 1987. Tension between the two nations persisted until June 1994, when Libyan troops withdrew from Chad, complying with a decision of the International Court of Justice on February 13, 1994. Following the failures of Pan-Arabism, Gaddafi abandoned this approach in favor of Pan-Africanism. However, the beginnings of his future vision were already present in Gaddafi's Green Book, published in 1974. This unique document remains an unparalleled explanation of his political philosophy and laid the foundation for the Great Jamahiriya, or government by the masses, which he proclaimed in 1977. The Green Book predicted that other Arab powers, jealous of the Jamahiriya, would attempt to destroy it, thus laying the foundations for Gaddafi's Third Universal Theory. This theory, a complex blend of classical liberalism, Marxist socialism, and Islamic theology, rejects Western models of democracy in favor of direct democracy. Also, this theory also diverges from the principles of Islamic Sharia, which is considered incompatible with its socialist ideal. This position puts him at odds with many Islamic scholars, some even accusing him of elevating the Green Book to the same level as the Quran. Under Gaddafi's leadership, ambitious social programs were rolled out in crucial sectors such as education, health, housing, public works, as well as subsidies for electricity and basic foodstuffs. In Libya, the medical sector and education system were completely free, providing every citizen with access to health care and education at all levels, from primary school to specialized university studies. This was a clear difference from the expensive education systems in Europe and the United States. Financial support for families was a priority, with a $5,000 stipend for each woman giving birth to a child. Gaddafi's Libya was also distinguished by the absence of national debts, the nationalization of banks, and the guarantee of the right to housing for every citizen, thus eradicating the scourge of homelessness. Faced with environmental challenges such as the lack of access to drinking water due to the desert, Gaddafi initiated the world's largest irrigation project, the Great Artificial River. The aim of the project was to ensure access to safe drinking water for every Libyan citizen by deploying a complex network of pipes over 3,500 kilometers across the country's arid lands. This initiative also aimed to promote organic farming and improve the health of the population. Although the regime of Muammar Gaddafi brought a period of appreciable stability and prosperity to the Libyan people, the fall in the price of oil will lead to a considerable decrease in Libya's income, negatively impacting the standard of living of ordinary families. Political opposition then manifested itself in an increasingly visible way, with human rights groups becoming more and more vocal. Also, Muammar Gaddafi, once a staunch supporter of the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, found himself at odds with Egypt after his peace agreement with Israel in 1979. In response, Gaddafi sought to strengthen ties with the Soviet Union, making Libya the first country outside the Soviet bloc to receive MiG-25 fighters. Although relations with the Soviet Union remained relatively distant, Gaddafi also sought to expand Libyan influence by supporting anti-government movements in Africa. During apartheid South Africa, Libya distinguished itself by providing early support to the African National Congress, ANC, which was engaged in an armed struggle against the white minority regime. In 1979, when Idi Amin suffered a heavy defeat at the hands of Tanzania, Muammar Gaddafi sent a force to Uganda to try to keep him in power. Unfortunately, this attempt turned into a fiasco, leaving behind a humiliating failure. In December 1988, Libyan agents were blamed for planting a bomb on board Pan Am Flight 103, causing an explosion over Lockerbie, Scotland, and claiming the lives of 259 people on board. The flaming debris rained down on Lockerbie, tragically killing another 11 people on the ground. In 1992, the UN imposed draconian sanctions on Tripoli, sealing Gaddafi's total isolation from the rest of the world. Despite Gaddafi's stubborn refusal to admit responsibility for the attack, the Tripoli leader finally agreed to pay compensation to the victims' families. However, this positive outcome was only made possible by the decisive intervention of the then South African president, Nelson Mandela. The latter, whom Gaddafi had previously supported in his struggle against apartheid in South Africa, made a highly publicized visit to Gaddafi, accompanied by UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan. In 1999, under the shadow of this influential mediation, Gaddafi agreed to a crucial compromise, handing over the two suspects to the Netherlands to be tried under Scottish law. This decision leads to the lifting of UN sanctions, but US sanctions against Libya remain in place. Despite the controversies, Gaddafi remained popular in Libya and the Arab world, symbolizing Arab pride and resistance to Western imperialism, reinforced by his flamboyant personality and unique style of dress. Shortly before the 2000s, Muammar Gaddafi seemed to be striving to change his image in the West. 2 years before the tragic events of September 11, 2001, Libya announced its commitment to fight al-Qaeda and offered to open its weapons program to international inspection. At the time, Bill Clinton's administration refused this offer, as the Libyan weapons program was not considered a threat at the time, with the issue of the Lockerbie suspects taking center stage. After the September 11 attacks, Gaddafi was one of the first Muslim leaders to vigorously condemn al-Qaeda. He would even appear on American television for an open interview, a move that would have seemed unthinkable less than a decade earlier. So, on May 15, 2006, the US State Department made a potentially game-changing announcement, the re-establishment of full diplomatic relations with Libya, but on a crucial condition. Gaddafi must formally abandon Libya's weapons of mass destruction program. In addition, the State Department announces that Libya will be removed from the list of nations supporting terrorism. In July 2007, Nicolas Sarkozy, newly president of France, made a short visit to Libya, sealing several agreements with Gaddafi. This period saw the release of several political prisoners in Libya, with the permission of NGO visits to the prisons. The outcome of the Bulgarian nurses case marks a turning point in this year, when 5 Bulgarian nurses and an anesthetist, detained for the alleged contamination of Libyan children with the AIDS virus, are released. However, the reports point out that torture persists in Libya, accompanied by speedy trials. In December 2007, a few months after the resolution of the Bulgarian nurses case, Muammar Gaddafi was received in Paris by President Nicolas Sarkozy. This state visit, considered a crucial step in the process of Libya's reintegration into the international community, nevertheless arouses controversy in France because of the human rights situation in Libya. Gaddafi's stay in France was marked by the announcement of many contracts, although most were never signed. In February 2009, Gaddafi became chairman of the African Union (AU) and spoke at the United Nations General Assembly later that year. In this speech, he sharply criticized the UN, with this memorable speech. This would later cause significant problems for Gaddafi. In early 2010, Gaddafi's attempt to extend his term as head of the AU beyond the usual one-year term was met with resistance from several other African countries and was ultimately rejected. Then came the Arab Spring, which marked a crucial turning point after more than 40 years of Gaddafi's rule in Libya. Despite improvements in the quality of life and efforts to counter the civil war, growing dissatisfaction is taking hold among large segments of the population. Human rights abuses and the authoritarian nature of the government led to disenchantment with Gaddafi's leadership of the country. Protests against repression and food shortages erupt in Benghazi, triggering a day of rage across the country, giving rise to Libya's first civil war. In March 2011, an alarming rumor spread like wildfire that Gaddafi's forces were preparing to massacre thousands of civilians in Benghazi and across Libya. Faced with this imminent threat, the Western powers and their allies are faced with a crucial choice: to remain spectators or to engage in humanitarian intervention in the name of the Libyan revolution. Consultations are intensifying between French, British, Arab allies and the Libyan opposition leader. At the White House, a decisive moment took shape at a meeting of the National Security Council chaired by Barack Obama. Hillary Clinton, then U.S. Secretary of State, stood up with conviction. It implores the president to support a U.S. NATO-led military campaign, arguing that America cannot remain indifferent to Gaddafi's massacre of Libyan citizens. On March 17, 2011, the United Nations Security Council adopted a resolution, led by the United States, authorizing all necessary measures to protect civilian lives. The UN has given the green light to NATO and the regional allies of the Gulf Cooperation Council to impose a no-fly zone over Libya. The mission is clear: priority is given to the protection of civilians. An arms embargo and a freeze on the assets of the Libyan authorities were also approved. The intervention campaign took shape, led by French, American, British and Qatari forces. Still, emails leaked later suggested that financial motivations, such as Libya's gold reserves and the creation of a Pan-African currency, influenced some Western leaders' support for the invasion. Despite the stated civil defense objectives, it became clear that the overthrow of Gaddafi was the priority of NATO and the Gulf Cooperation Council, leading to considerable chaos and destruction in Libya. Behind the scenes, a financial intrigue is brewing. Nicolas Sarkozy, the French president at the time, saw Gaddafi not only as a threat, but also as a man who would have financed his victorious 2007 presidential campaign with a colossal sum of €50 million. In August 2011, Gaddafi's grip on power gradually weakened as Libyan rebels and NATO planes launched an offensive in Tripoli. Gaddafi, determined to resist, appealed to his supporters, denouncing a plot to control oil and recolonize Libya. He says, "There is a conspiracy to control living oil and to colonize Libya once again. We will fight to the last man and woman to defend Libya from east to west, from north to south." After avoiding attacks for many months, Gaddafi was finally spotted and captured by a rebel group, ending his life in a pipeline in Sirte on October 20, 2011. News reports from Chicago confirmed his death. 12 years later, Libya remains politically fragile, with a security situation that remains as dangerous and unpredictable as ever. Gaddafi had a bold economic project: to create an African gold currency, the dinar, to promote trade between the countries of the continent and free Africa from the influences of the dollar and the euro. He even dreamed of an African Union with a common currency. Gold-rich Libya was strengthening its economic independence with a state-owned bank issuing interest-free currency. Gaddafi, chairman of the African Union in 2009, advocated a government of African unity for development, and without Western involvement. However, the West, fearing a destabilization of the world order, rejected the idea. To sum up, the invasion of Libya was primarily motivated by money, power, oil, and the preservation of French influence over Francophone Africa. Demonized by Nicolas Sarkozy, who is backed by Barack Obama, Europe and NATO, Gaddafi was overthrown in the name of supposedly liberating the people from a tyrant. Barack Obama would later admit that the failure to deal with the aftermath of Gaddafi's death was the worst mistake of his presidency. Since then, Libya has been plunged into a brutal civil war, torn apart by rival factions fighting for control of the country. A complex history of power, manipulation, and disastrous consequences. Thus ended Gaddafi's saga, from his humble beginnings to a rise to power followed by a precipitous fall. He remains a complex and controversial figure, emphasizing the importance of revisiting his history without being influenced by biased media narratives. Despite humanist aspirations, Gaddafi was demonized in the Western media, justifying military attacks and resulting in the loss of innocent lives. Nevertheless, its mission to help African countries towards independence and freedom persists. A complex story, full of nuances, questioning the truth behind the media narratives. What do you think of Muammar Gaddafi? Share your thoughts in the comments section. For now, thank you so much for watching the video so far. I hope this story has captivated you and that you have discovered new aspects about one of the most controversial leaders of the modern era. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a thumbs up, and for those who want to know more, download my brand new ebook for free. Thank you again for your attention and see you next time.